So I'll start with a question on Qur'an 434. Men, which we've translated as men are maintainers of women by that which God has distinguished the one over the other, and by that which they expend of their property. So righteous women are devoutly obedient women, those who safeguard during absence what for God is to be safeguarded. And if you fear the women's defiance, then admonish them and forsake them in the beds and strike them. But if they obey you, seek not a way against them. Indeed, God is high, mighty. So we're interested in discussing your interpretation of Qur'an 434, both to understand your position on this verse and also as an example of feminist hermeneutics when interpreting difficult verses. In your book, Qur'an and Women, you in some ways glossed over the difficulty that people might have with Qur'an 434, but in your other book, Inside the Gender Jihad, you confronted it directly. Can you describe how and why you came to change your stance on Qur'an 434, if indeed your stance changed at all? And do you see your own evolution in approaching this verse as mirroring developments in Islamic feminism, from the largely apologetic tone adopted by many early feminists to a tone of recognition that the Qur'an as a pre-modern text is not entirely egalitarian?
A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. I begin, as I always begin, in the name of Allah, whose grace I seek in this and all other matters. Certainly this particular verse, 434, excuse me, has followed me around my entire, intellectual and spiritual, trajectory. And I'm really happy to know that it caused in me enough concern that I would return to it again and again. And in the process, have been able to also write about, what you call some of my evolution. So first I want to kind of say something about my position when Qur'an and Woman came out, which was my dissertation for the PhD. So this was based on research I'd done in the 1980s. And the dissertation was completed in 1988. And all I did was, when I took my first university position in Malaysia in 1989, is find a publisher and edited it for the small volume. There were no new questions asked of me with regard to that verse for the purpose of the process of editing. So it pretty much is a replication of what came to me in the process of investigating gender in the Qur'an from my graduate studies. It doesn't mean that everything, sort of set well with me. It simply meant that I wanted to give it attention in as much as it caused me pause. And I wanted to see the ways in which I might be able to reconcile, what was, I was a little bit hesitant about. Interestingly enough, 2 years after Qur'an and Woman was first published, in 1992, I was in South Africa. And I remember being asked about this verse, as people do, and my saying something like, if there was one verse in the Quran that I wish was not in there, it would be that verse. And that spread out as some kind of heretical statement that I made. Keep that in mind when I get to Inside the Gender Jihad. Because for the writing of Qur'an and Woman, and at that time, I really took the statement in the Qur'an, we believe in the book, the whole of the book, as literally meaning we agree and personally affirm, and in fact have deep devotion, faith, and confidence in everything in the book. And that was my goal. my goal and my expectation of my own faith journey was that anything that was in the Qur'an was going to be okay as long as I worked on devotion. So it was a kind of a spiritual journey. And I should say that the spiritual journey is that the first time I read the Qur'an, which was only in English, I fell in love with the Qur'an. I fell so in love with the Qur'an that I made an entire career out of it and even wrote books. So the nice thing is that I'm still in love with the Qur'an. And yet, there is the romantic stage of love when everything is roses, so that you don't have to have any shadow places. You simply just, everything is great because it's the Qur'an. And in fact, the journey for me, required of me to immerse myself in the study of Arabic and live in Arabic-speaking countries, and just a worldview that's also shaped by the language. And I have no regrets about any of the steps on that journey. However, when it came time for me to write this for the purpose of the dissertation in the late 1980s, there was no discourse with regard to what we now consider to be, the 5 or 6 problematic verses in the Qur'an with regard to gender relations. And this, of course, is the number 1 passage. Nobody was talking about it in any way, shape, or form, except in that modality of complete acceptance that everything in the Qur'an is equal to everything else in the Qur'an, and the only perspective for a believer is one where there is acceptance of everything in exactly the way that it's written, with the exact same amount of love. So for me, what I did was investigated the individual items that are in the text to try to see what was the expanse of meaning that could be determined based on those terms. So for example, الرجال قوامون على النساء, which later gets to be cast as Qiwama, that men have Qiwama over women. Qiwama, coming from the root form qama, has an interesting evolution into the way it is presumed to have meaning in this passage. In this passage, it means men are in charge. And yet every place else where there's any version of, qama or qiwama or qama or any, it doesn't have that same meaning. I didn't know this at the time, but I began to study just starting from the root form and to see other places in the Qur'an where it was used, like aqim salat, establish salat, take responsibility for salat. So I determined that I would not use any hierarchical words, but I would use words of nurturing and caretaking. And I translated it as men have a responsibility towards women. And I confirmed this by using faḍl al-Qur'an, the tafsir by Said Qutb, in which he says, given the nature of men and women in the context, especially of conjugal relationships or marriage, and women being the child bearers, men need to have something that is equally significant to the continuity of humanity. That is, we need more people and somebody has to bear them. At the moment, it's just women who can do that. How do we have men on par with that? So we give them this responsibility over women. And then he, like everybody else, relates it to what comes next, which is financial responsibility, nafaqa. For me, reducing Qiwama only to a monetary consideration in my early days, I felt was inadequate. And this again was, I had reasons for why I thought was inadequate, because I didn't want the man and the woman to be characterized only in terms that presumed that men were financially responsible at all times and in all places. And it is for that reason that they have Qiwama. Because, and this was a question I asked of my friends in fiqh, well, what happens if women are taking that financial responsibility? Do they become qa'ima? And nobody had ever even heard of a thought like that. And yet, technically, in the way in which it is aligned to wage earning and financial caretaking, that's absolutely feasible. I mean, if that's all it is, bima yunfiqu alayhinna. I mean, if women are doing the nafaqah, then women become qa'im. So the second question that I had when I was looking at it is, what exactly is the purview of a relationship which is characterized by Qiwama? And is it a man with regard to a woman in the context of a conjugal relationship, taking also into consideration that, a man can have more than one wife? But is it that men have Qiwama over women, so all men have Qiwama over all women? And what's the purview of it? And why can we not say that if, given the interpretation of Sajid, if it is about extending a responsibility for the caretaking of women, especially as child bearers, why can we not presume Qiwama is an operation of the state? The state has a responsibility for the caretaking of women in the process of being child bearers. So it's not personal. It's not a kind of personal hegemony. So in the sense at which I did not grapple with the more problematic part of the verse, which I'm going to get to, at that time, Qiwama for me was not the linchpin. I did not walk away with the idea that it means men in charge. And so for some people, not seeing that and therefore not having any contention with it seems apologetic. However, the real coup is what happens when we get to the triple solutions that are offered for recalcitrant women at the end. And at that time, in the early part of my research, I also surmised from this verse that the Qur'an does not order women to obey. This was my first community controversy. To say this out loud in a mosque or a confessional context, actually had one of the women coming to me on the side to say, don't say that, and I'm like, I don't understand. But if you look at it, the amr form, the command form, is not used with regard to qunut or even with regard to ta'a. It says, wa in ata'nakum, and if they obey you. And so it is conditional terms, whereas there are certain commands that are made in terms of these three recommendations on the men. So I just looked at it in a linguistic way and said that ta'a, it does mean human to human obedience, but qunut is more about obedience to God, using, for example, the way in which Maryam is referred to, and many other uses of qanitat in the Quran, and even the bees, for example, we use this word. So that I didn't look at qunut as obedience. Now, and this is what happens when you do not come out of a Muslim cultural milieu where this verse has been promoted as settling the matter once and for all. Instead, it's just one of many verses, and I'm looking at it, and when I look at it, I don't see the level of hegemony that other people experience because of it, and to be frank, the way in which especially fiqh or jurisprudence traditions developed it and then created a coda And that coda we have found in our recent publication, especially by Dr. Umayma Abu Bakr, that coda is, the linchpin of that coda is in fact Qiwama. And Qiwama isn't even a word in the Qur'an, but it becomes a frame for the perpetuation of male superiority. And the frame is never going to be limited to just men because they pay, because they pay. If the frame becomes totalistic, and over the centuries, additional conditions about why men are in charge are added, including in the most recent periods of the social sciences, psychological ones, women are weak and men are strong and women are emotional and men are rational, and none of this is in the Quran, and actually none of this was in the first few centuries of tafsir, but in the later tafsirs they did start to encode more and more of it. So actually Qiwama takes on a life of its own, which I think was kind of interesting, but none of that was in my purview. But the idea that women must obey husbands was already starting to breach the territory of problematic for me, even in the early stages of my, my research and development. And so I was careful to interrogate the reality that the Quran does not put that down as an amr, as a command. And I was always curious about the knee-jerk reaction that came in certain cultural and confessional contexts with regard to it. But I think understanding Qiwama and understanding, kunut and ta'a, in their conditional ways that I understood them even at that time, was very helpful for the location that I came to with regard to the three recommendations. And I saw the three, sorry.
Go ahead. Sorry, no, I don't mean to interrupt you, Amina. I'm just conscious of the fact that we're recording, so we may need smaller bites, but also not trusting the video. I could go any minute. I just want to pick up on this issue of the lexicon of the Quran, because I think I'm thinking about the word qiwama and the root itself. I mean, in English, of course, we have the notion of, we don't say to patronize as in to give patronage to, but we recognize that the concept itself of a patron is somebody who looks after somebody, gives them financial support. But there is a small slippage into to patronize and as in to kind of betray a feeling of superiority. So I'm just wondering whether there is a kind of, there's an analogy here with how we approach the Qiwama. I mean, it might strike some readers of the Quran as that there is an inherent superiority there in the way that the verse addresses, the responsibilities of men towards women. And is it that we're really just undergoing a cultural shift in our understanding of what we need? That's a necessary cultural shift that we have to make in terms of the lexicon of the Quran. Because I do want to, in a second, I will move to ask you about, how do you get past these lexical difficulties? Because there's a quote by you about saying no to the literal interpretation. So I'll get there in a minute. But perhaps if you would just address this issue of, is it a cultural shift that we have to make because of modernity, because of the notion of egalitarianism and so on?
Unfortunately, your question asked me to read backwards, and it's a little bit in contradistinction to the order that I was reading forward. Okay. And yet, in terms of understanding patronage, and in the final product for me, and that is reading for reciprocal relationships between all human beings, the term Qiwama serves a certain function that is not hegemonic, but is in fact a utility between people, until you submit it to centuries of Muslim practice, law, culture, and interpretation. Over time, a composite is made that imbues with, men in the Qiwama relationship the effect of being in charge. And they are in charge because they are superior. So it is not so much whether or not I read it that way, because I did not, It is because we do not read text in isolation of communities. And the communities of the Qur'an have been dominated by the same kind of patriarchy that exists everywhere else. And as a result, there is sufficient fodder in the constructs of this passage to yield the idea that it is not just because men are nice and they take care of people. It is because men perceive of themselves and even make confirmation that they belong in the position in charge that we end up in trouble. We have a volume called Men in Charge, ? And it is 100% about this verse. So there are stages in my life, and coincidentally, the stage comes back to looking at Qiwama, whereas in my work, it really goes forward by looking at the latter part of the verse.
Karen, do you want to take the lead?
Sure.
You want to share that volume while your camera is centered also. Yes.
Men in Charge, about Qur'an 434. ? Yeah, exactly. So on Qur'an 434, you said, there is no getting around this one, even though I've tried through different methods for 2 decades. I simply do not and cannot condone permission for a man to scourge or apply any kind of strike to a woman. This leads me to clarify how I have finally come to say no outright to the literal implementation of this passage. This also has implications in implementing the hudud, penal code ordinances. This verse and the literal implementation of the hudud both imply an ethical standard of human actions that are archaic and barbarian at this time in history. They are unjust in the ways that human beings have come to experience and understand justice, and hence unacceptable to universal notions of human dignity. And that's from your book, Inside the Gender Jihad. So we're wondering, what does it mean to say no to the literal interpretation or implementation of a verse? And can anyone say no to parts of the Qur'an? And in what circumstances might that happen?
So I also had to evolve to this location from, where I was when I first published. And the evolution was born 100% in the field of the struggles for gender justice and equality, particularly in participating as one of the founding members of Sisters in Islam and one of the resource persons for the Musawa movement, which is a movement for reform in Muslim personal status law. And that is because when you have a passage like this one that literally says, and strike them, whether or not there are caveats to go with that or not, it leads to a very slippery slope in the context of another global movement, which is a movement to eradicate all forms of violence against women. Now, trying to wed these two things, that is my field of interpretation and theology, and this sort of activism in terms of policy reform and the like, was actually, it was almost as beautiful for me as coming across the Qur'an, not long after I became Muslim. And that was, when you are interpreting the Qur'an simply on the basis of linguistics, philosophy, even ethics in the abstract way in which they're often done, it is possible for you to deliberate a long time over nuances of the language, and that's all you do. When, however, you are faced with the lived reality, there is a consequence on how you relate to text. Now, when I first began working, with activist groups, I would say that I could be identified as text over context. By the time the process was over, I had been converted to context over text. And I want to tell you that this verse is precisely the way to demonstrate that an application, that's what I mean by implementation, an application of a verse must achieve the overall Qur'anic ethos or the principles, virtues, or values like justice. And justice for women can only be determined by women. And all of the research with regard to domestic violence, be it in the context of Muslims or not, all of it confirms that not only violence, but the potential threat of violence is harmful for women. And so I had to grapple with how to get from the command form, to the lived reality. And I was challenged because I was accused of being so Qur'an-centric that I could not see beyond it, and everything had to be confirmed in it. And I didn't feel that way in my gut, but I also wasn't clear how to get there. So writing that chapter in Inside the Ginger Jihad is a representation of the evolutionary process. And that evolutionary process actually becomes a methodology. And that methodology hinges upon the awareness that there is both am and khas in the Qur'an. There are general statements and there are specific statements. And specific statements have no implementation component to them. So if the wives of the Prophet are ordered to not marry after he dies, there's no general rule that comes from that. We don't have, you burn yourself on the funeral pyre like they do in certain parts of Hindu tradition in the past. We don't have that. So it is not a universal. Sorry, it's not an am. For me, universal is bigger than am. But as soon as you realize that the purview of application of certain Quranic passages is not universal, then it is easy to go to a particular passage and determine, well, what is the purview of application of this? And given the history of interpretation with regard to this passage, even in the context of the dominant male traditions, where they start to make caveats, bil mishwak or ramziyan, with the dental stick, or in a metaphorical way. As soon as they start to give caveats that are also not part of literal Qur'an, it says that human beings have intervened with the meaning of the Qur'an for the purpose of achieving certain social goods or maslahah. And now we come to the final stage. Well, the third stage for me was feminist interpretation that brought doubt on whether or not we had fully understood this passage. And if you look at Laleh Bakhtiar's book, she's fond of talking about 30 different interpretations of the word though. So there is this idea that, well, maybe we don't know what it means, maybe it's not just the literal sense of it. But the final stage is to say, we use the measurement and evidentiary basis of women's lived realities with domestic violence to determine the extent to which this verse can be used as a rubric of application in the context of community. And the answer is no. So it does not remove it from the Qur'an. It simply says that all of the understanding of it in the context of 7th century Arabia is not going to be matched in the context of 21st, 23rd, 25th century global realities of Islam. So when people talk about the methodology of lived reality, it's not just how you feel. It is also constructing a corollary between evidence in the context of certain practices and how those practices might be understood if you just take them, literally, even out of the Qur'an.
Tui, Amina, it's interesting that you should refer to quite a hermeneutical hermeneutically, I guess, specific technique, which is to identify the am versus the khas. How much, I'm interested in how you've been able to, I guess, mine the traditional toolkit for, you know, for your purpose, in which is the wider purpose that serves justice for women and so on. Are there any more of these tools that are just as useful? I mean, they're traditional tools. They're these categories of how you kind of approach the Quran. And actually, this is very interesting. I didn't know about this, the method that you use, but it struck me because I've worked with medieval texts, and I've you know, this is a kind of hermeneutic that is identified and used. That's interesting for me. How do you feel about that? You're trying to somehow, you know, you're using the tools of the tradition, but somehow to kind of rejuvenate that tradition's reading of the text of the scripture. Maybe you could expand on that.
Yes, it's rather a fun project, actually. Even now, when I teach in just workshops with activists, I start with the ulum al-Qur'an. And the reason I do is to, well, our task usually is to demystify the Qur'an, to stop having it stand outside of us and to have us stand inside of it. The am and khas, which, as you noticed, I said were not the full categories, because there's khas, am, and then there's universal. But universal wasn't articulated by the classical exegetes, because actually the notion of universal is a kind of 20th century thing. But the use of the existing disciplines of Qur'anic studies indicates to me that it is a discipline, and that the object of the discipline is the comprehension of the revelation. And if the revelation has as its goal, hudan lil muttaqin, that is guidance, then the revelation's task is not complete unless and until humans actually use it. So I think Karen asked a question earlier that, you know, is kind of appropriate to try to bring in here, and that is, you know, well, can you say no at other places? People say no to the Quran all the damn time. And we don't make a big deal out of it until there is a power base, and that power base has been encoded in the context of patriarchy that has run through our intellectual tradition as if it is one and the same as even Allah. So it's really important to understand that, for example, when the Quran tells us that, you know, you can't eat lahm khanzir unless you're under duress, there are people who don't eat meat at all. And in not eating meat, which is permitted in the Quran, they give an ethical Islamic justification for it. And that means that they're saying no to the Quran's permission to eat meat. But you never hear about this when you start talking politics of Islam. It's only in these situations with regard to gender, and I would say also with regard to sexuality, that all of a sudden it's a done deal. And what makes the deal done, supposedly, is the classical discourse. Well, the classical discourse, humu rijal wa nahnu rijal. The classical discourse is just discourse. And according to people like Surush, they fulfilled the justice of their time, and we must fulfill the justice of our time. And the justice in the classical period, again, across traditions, not just Islam, was that there was a treatment owed to a person relative to their status that differed from the treatment owed to a person in a different status. We have now replaced that with a universal human rights understanding, which is about equality and reciprocity. And equality and reciprocity across gender is a loggerhead in the context of Muslim discourse, because so much was written in the milieu of well-meaning people who had what Aisha Chowdhury calls an idealized cosmology, which was in fact hegemonic. We live in the context of an idealized cosmology, which is in fact egalitarian. And neither of these idealized cosmologies is superior to another, but they have a facility with regard to context. Remember what I said? I've now become context over text. Well, one of the things about our context is that you do not have to agree with Qur'anic statements about slavery just because the institution of slavery was not condemned in the Qur'an, because that was then and this is now. And now we know that every human being deserves what? لَقَدْ كَرَمْنَا بَنِي آدَمَ. They deserve karama, and that slavery is not an institution of karama or dignity. So we live in it's a systemic thing, you know, it's a paradigm shift where the Qur'an articulated enough on a trajectory that if we were to follow it, we would get to the place that we are, but we tend to want to recede on certain issues because of a literal text. And I have finally been freed of the necessity to justify any specific text because of the whole of the text and because of the author of the text, whom we believe to be Allah.
Amina, I think just you raised a really interesting point here with regards to the text and our relationship to it, because I think, isn't it in a sense that you're saying, you know, we work from within, into the Quran from a cultural perspective. Let's say we have a universal ethic now of egalitarianism. So in a sense, we have to make that fit into the Quran. I mean, you know, how the Quran be denying that? So sort of, if you just indulge me for a minute, it does seem to be working from a kind of cultural context into the Quran. It's not really working from the Quran into our cultural context. And that might not come very intuitively to a lot of people. I mean, it's very sophisticated and astute to kind of imagine that there is some correlation between any ideal cultural value at any point in historical time and the Quran's eternal truth. And I think, you know, isn't it the case that a lot of people assume the truth to come from the Quran and then have to kind of do all kind of gymnastics, like, I guess, to square that with their cultural context? But for you, you're saying, I mean, it seems effortless, because you're saying we just happen to have a universal ethic here, which seems, you know, reasonable, which is to be equal, to have egalitarianism and so on. And surely the Quran has it. So let's go back to the Quran and work out how that fits. I mean, I'm just for the sake of argument and really just flushing out what I think is a very interesting perspective. How do you see that? How do you see the relationship between reading the text and working from the text or working into the text? I'm just curious.
Yes, I think, you know, once again, there's a little bit of politics in this conversation, you know, like which is superior, our current milieu or the Quran, which is not where I'm going at all. Where I'm going instead is the purpose of the Quran is human beings and their well-being. Therefore, we are the markers. If the Quran would become obsolete, we would lose so much. And the way to do it is to grapple with those articulations that did not pursue the full trajectory as encoded in the Quran itself, and to make them stop points or milestones, hate to use that word, but you know, milestones along the way to the completion of what is called in Sufi terms al-insan al-kamil. In other words, the completion of the full breadth of our capacity as human beings having human lives. And because every human being at every point in history had a human life, how we understand history is again on the path of that trajectory. In other words, for some people, because the Prophet ﷺ, you know, is the epitome of, you know, the sacred light and everything, and because the revelation came to him, there is a tendency to understand the prophetic perfection as if it removed him from the rampant patriarchy of his time and culture, in which he also participated in the most benevolent way. How do you grapple with this unless you understand that we are put at a certain time in the place that is the earth for this human adventure? And we have tools, we have ayat, we have signs, we have ways to push us towards the achievement of greater and greater ethical completions of our humanity. And the Qur'an and its ayat are part of the signs. It's part of the way forward. But the Qur'an itself points us to ayats in the implicit realm, which is everything else around us. In other words, lived reality. The lived reality must be addressed by the Qur'an in order for the Qur'an to be relevant to it. So if you wish to keep the Qur'an alive, then you must grapple with the places where Qur'anic articulation is locked into the means of articulation that were available in 7th century. For example, everywhere in the Qur'an where it talks about the movement between the sun and the earth, it uses what we still use in our language, things like sunrise and sunset, but the sun does not move. I mean, it moves because our whole galaxy is moving. It is the Earth's rotation on its axis that causes the sun to appear to set and rise. And I did some investigation of this, just a little bit further because I was curious about it. I'm like, did anybody get this? Because from the perspective of the God that I know, it's pretty clear that it's not the sun that's moving. So why is it that that's the language that's used? Well, you know why. That was the signifier that identified the perception of the experience vis-a-vis the earth and the sun. And as such, the language is not scientifically accurate. Does that mean that Allah made a mistake? No. Again, I go back to, from the context of 7th century Arabia, certain principles and ideals were established, but the fulfillment of them sometimes took, in fact, the trajectory of the process of living or life of human beings. And that's why slavery was never condemned in the Quran. And yet, I don't know anybody who doesn't find it, abhorrent. So we are dealing with what is the nature of living ethics and what is the relationship of Quran to that living ethics. For me, the Quran is always a companion. But the only way for the Quran to be a companion for me, and I say this in all sincerity personally, is that I had to grapple with the places where, as the statement goes from inside the gender jihad, no matter how much you do with it, I just cannot condone a man beating his wife. So what does that mean? And I grappled with this. It was almost one of those dark nights of the soul, until I went through the process of the development of the methodology that I show in that book, and I mentioned it earlier. So we do have to grapple with specifics, and we have to determine their application in real context. And if we do not do that, what we have said is humanity does not matter, because the Quran is superior. And I am saying the Quran is addressed to humanity because humanity matters.
Thank you so much for that. And I do have to say that with regard to one of the points that you made very early on about gender exceptionalism, I do say to my students all the time, well, sure. I mean, if you look at the question of interest, charging interest, riba, or anything like that, you'll notice a lot of very conservative people have performed a lot of gymnastics in order to be able to do modern banking, right? And if you look at other questions like slavery, as you mentioned, you'll notice that people have no problem reinterpreting it. And so it's sometimes hard for people to grasp that the gender stuff is actually the exception rather than the rule in terms of reinterpretation. And I think that that's just such a significant point that bears repeating. It really, yeah. So right now we'd just like to get into a couple of other verses. One is one that you've spoken about pretty extensively in your first book, Qur'an and Women, and that's, "O people, be wary of your Lord, who created you from a single soul, and from it created its pair or mate, and spread forth from the two many men and women, and be wary of God, by whom you petition one another and the wombs. Indeed, God is watcher over you. In your book, Qur'an and Women, you began with this verse and a discussion of the single soul and its mate as an example of gender egalitarianism, with each zawj, that is mate or pair, member of a pair, as inherently equal. Is this the kind of verse that might act as a proof text for your position on religious authority, the equal ability of women and men to act as interpreters of the Qur'an, prayer leaders, or other positions involving religious authority?
Well, thank you for the question. I had to think about how to respond to this, because the answer is this is not a text that necessarily I would use. Instead, it is a theology that I surmise from the Qur'an under what I call the Tawhidic paradigm. It relates to this in that the beginning of understanding it is to understand the distinctive nature of the divine reality, Allah. And that reality, according to the Qur'an, which says, Laysa kamithlihi shay, is not like things, shay, but min kulli shayin khalaqna zawjayn, from all things, all shay, we created the pair, meaning that duality is a feature of the created world. And the conclusion I draw from that is that the nature of Allah transcends, even though we all hope to have an intimate relationship with him or her, but transcends gender. Allah is neither male nor female. And the reason that that understanding began to have an impact on my relationship to questions of authority and to the issue, for example, of women as prayer leaders, is because I also encoded that theology into a rubric of social justice that says, if you believe in the one God, and that God is Akbar, or the greatest, then no human being can be above another human being, especially for reasons as arbitrary as gender or race or class or even religion, but rather human beings act in a relationship of horizontal reciprocity, with Allah keeping them from positions of, what Shaitan calls istikbar, of being superior to another. It allows, therefore, for an exchange, especially in terms of the duties, that is the embodiment of acts in the context of doing good, including worship. It allows for an exchange to those positions, and therefore there is no natural or automatic hegemony or authority. Once I understood this for myself at the level where I could, in fact, do performances with confidence that I was not defying my intended quote unquote role as a woman, then it was possible for me also to accept to perform as the Imam of Salat, for example, in a mixed gender context. Before that time, I may have had a kind of inclination, but I didn't quite understand what it meant in terms of a grounding theologically. Once I grounded theologically, then it means this: no person's opinion is better than another person's opinion, except on the basis of the evidence that they bring forth to their truth claim. So this is what we understood as part of the Islamic intellectual tradition all along. There is no fixed answer, and just because you have a beard doesn't mean your answer has to be better, so you're naturally an authority, so everybody should obey you. But rather, what is the evidentiary basis that you bring? And if your evidentiary base is insufficient, especially juxtaposed to someone else, then that means that that person has authority, and that person could be the trash collector on your street, a blue-collar worker. So to deconstruct the notion of authority for me was only possible when we moved what I call towards a democratization of authority. And again, that was brought out of the lived realities. And that is that people are not given the opportunity to speak with regard to laws that are encoded in different countries supposedly in the name of Islam, but actually they're in the name of an interpretation of Islam, and those interpretations are predominantly hegemonic and patriarchal.
So I'm really interested in this, in the Tawhidic paradigm, as in no human being being above another human being. But in the Quran, from what I understand, and please correct me if I'm wrong, or maybe Feras wants to add some nuance to what I might say about it. There is a notion of faḍl, which is that we have preferred or given some more than others, and even some prophets over other prophets. And so I'm wondering about how that relates to your Tawhidic paradigm, or maybe Feras wants to give some other examples, I'm not sure. Okay.
No, I think I would just value Amina's thoughts on this, because of course, I think the tension, and I think it's not necessarily, and I see how you understand these tensions as productive tensions, which I think is a really valuable thought. But there is a sense in which you talk about contingency, but you're being very, talk about agency as well, right? So, I mean, it is contingent that we are born male and female. It is just one of those contingencies of life. But it then sounds like you're being much more much more agentic towards this assumption of a role. I mean, you're saying this, yes, we're not, we may be born male or female, but it shouldn't really matter. And yet you somehow make it matter by your kind of, what is it? Subversion of the idea that, males should be the authoritative voices, subverting the idea and saying that women also have a voice, and you act as a woman in a social historical place. After all, your very work, all of it, has meaning precisely because you've gone through this process of you are a woman who understands these texts, have been able to kind of bring new light to understand this. So the tension between contingency and agency is very interesting for me here. But I think it's just I'll let you perhaps just respond to Karen's issue about the faḍl in creation. I mean, that's almost part of the fabric. That's the point. I mean, the point is that we have to kind of endure a kind of creational tafaḍl until we get to the goal, which is the next life, al-hayawan, the true life, and so on. So just your thoughts on that would be really insightful.
Yes, I do have to say that just a small caveat before I deal with the main point, and that is not everyone born in a male or female body ends their life as male or female in accordance to their birth. I am a cisgendered female. I was born in a female body, and I'm okay with that. But I have many friends and people that I work with and people that I try to work for who are not, they are trans. And so it's important for me to just say that about just that coincidence. With regard to faḍl, I spent some time on this as well, because faḍl, in the way in which it's used in the Qur'an, is something that is granted from a transcendent location into a concrete or, earthly or alim al-shahada, into the, the known world, the seen world. And as such, faḍl cannot be encapsulated into a whole class of people, gender, race, etc. And so when the Qur'an even says it, بِمَا فَضَّلَ اللَّهُ بَعْضَهُمْ عَلَى بَعْضٍ, the ba'd, some of them, already lets you know that it is a kind of ambiguous category. And the ambiguity of the category is not something that one can take on with regard to themselves as an individual or with regard to a particular what's the word, genre or classification, like men are superior. It is itself ambiguous enough that when you take it on in that way, you defy the actual or the literal articulation of in the Quran. So I like that point about it, but also over time, what I found is that you have no way to earn or even to conceive, therefore determine what is the faḍl. So because you cannot, and because everywhere that the Quran uses it, it uses it as a thing that comes from Allah to, you know, to humankind or to the creation, it means that in the process of ethical human development, the characteristic of humility defies our taking it on and presuming it belongs to us. And once you take it on, you're in that slippery slope, because remember, once again, Iblis was created as a certain stage and yet determined that he was better. And as a consequence, the whole rubric of oppression or zulm came into the earth. So I don't think that faḍl can be made into something so specific that any specific group of persons can take it on and say, that means us.
Thank you so much for that answer. Let's see. So you said, and you alluded to this just a moment ago, you said that male and female are, quote, complementary and contingent equals. And I'm wondering what that means. And what are the implications for people who are LGBTQI or non-binary and who are not cisgender and heterosexual the way that we are?
Yes, I have come to abhor the term complementary. Is that going to help? Let's just start from there. The only reason why is because when we started working on musawa, which is a term that means reciprocal equality, when we started working on it, the best answer that we got from well-meaning, benevolent kind of patriarchal people was, yes, but women are complementary. And by complementary, this is what I say in a lecture. If a man is wearing an Armani suit and he has a handkerchief and a tie that complements his suit, he is by no means fully dressed with just a handkerchief and a tie. And because of that, I don't feel that the term complementary is adequate to express and also to dismantle the persistence of hegemony and arrive at equality, human dignity, and reciprocity in the way in which I now conceive of it. So when I used it earlier, it was because fundamentally, I believe that the creation is full of relationships, and relationships between people is the most important relationship that we have on this earth. Even someone who is an introvert really relies upon some kind of relationship. It just may be on terms very different from, say, a very social extrovert. But since relationships are important, then the fundamental relationship, that is the relationship of one human being to one other human being, is constantly being in practice with regard to how we resolve our desires for another and their ability to fulfill our desires. It starts off as a child and usually, you know, the parents. How much can the parents provide everything that this child desires, right? But in the ways in which we are also in intimate relationships of mawaddatan wa rahma, or love and mercy, with a partner, it comes into marriage partnerships. How do those work? When we cast marriage partnerships as if they are closed categories, one man and one woman, well, let's be honest, in terms of the Qur'an, one man and at least the possibility of more than one woman. When we cast them as only that, we forget to require of them some working at how that relationship will go. And so when we start to address the lived realities of non-binary people and gender non-conforming people in the full spectrum of LGBTQI, it teaches us something about the nature of human relations that we have neglected because of the presumption that there is an organic and natural relationship between male and female. It isn't natural, it isn't organic, it is work. So for me, when the Prophet, you know, upon him be peace, says, you know, that marriage is half of faith, I say that's half of what you have to work on in order to complete your faith. So I don't take it for granted that just because there is a relationship between a man and a woman, that all the terms of that relationship work, necessarily, and some set or rigid formula. And again, as I said, this is because of working with gender non-binary people, and it even causes me to return to the use of the word zawj in the passage we were talking about before. خلقكم من نفس واحدة وخلق منها زوجها. I decided to do an investigation of the word zawj across the Qur'an because I wanted to see whether or not its usage fell always into some type of formulaic, one on top, one on the bottom, one in charge kind of thing. And actually there are several constructs of the pair, because they're the mirror images, they're the opposites, and they're the complements. So I will come back to the word complement. All of these fit into the notion of pair. And yet the features of interrelationship means that with regard to human beings, we go through all three, right? Sometimes we're opposites, sometimes we're complements, and sometimes we're mirrors, right? So I think to return to the idea of humanity as a dynamic, and that each of us have this living, this living potential, means that our nature has to be re-encoded into something other than just a separate identity. And for that, I return to the words masculine and feminine, as opposed to male and female, because each of us are made up of masculine, that is active and outward pointing characteristics, and feminine, that is receptive and yielding. We have these in our one composite. We have these, and accepting and understanding how they work in tangent with each other within ourselves is another aspect of how I use the word tawheed today, because for me, the tawheedic paradigm also talks about the perfection, the insan and camel, the perfection of the relationship between even our own parts, so that they work in tandem with each other. And what complicates it for me, and that's a beautiful kind of complication, is that when we have a relationship with another person, that is a single, body, usually, there are obviously some conjoined twins, but usually a single body. When we have a relationship with another person, they also combine the masculine and feminine in themselves. And our masculine and feminine are always in conversations and complementations with the masculine and feminines in the other body. And I have found that sometimes people have overt kinds of attraction, say in the normative, heterosexual context, and yet there are parts of them that are in discord with the other person. It is almost as if the masculine doesn't get along with the masculine of this person, but because one is a female, we forget that she has it. Or the feminine doesn't get along with the feminine, but because he's male, we forget that he has it. And as such, we don't understand. There is constant give and take. There's constant assertion and reception. And that we ourselves are a composite of these two aspects or elements. And we are in constant relationship with other people where these two things are also in conversation. So now when I come away from the Qur'an, when I start talking about the two pair, I don't mean just male and female.
Thank you so much for that. And as you were speaking, I was really thinking about the process of faith and how there can be a real yielding of all human beings in that process. And how, yes, in that sense. So the next question that we wanted to ask was on the veil, or on covering and modesty. And that's with regard to Qur'an 24:31. And tell the believing women to lower their gaze and guard their private parts, and let them not display of their ornament except what is apparent of it, and let them draw their veils over their bosoms. and let them not reveal their ornament except to their husbands or their fathers, or their husbands' fathers, or their sons or their husbands' sons, or their brothers, or their brothers' sons, or sisters' sons, or their women folk, or what their right hand possesses, or their male dependents lacking sexual desire, or children uninitiated to women's nakedness. And let them not thump their feet or make known what they hide of their ornament. Turn to God in repentance altogether, O believers, that you may prosper. So inside the gender jihad, you speak about your own journey from your conversion to wearing hijab for 30 years as a Muslim, and to now wearing it sometimes, especially in professional context, but not all the time. You've explained this through your phrase, if you think the difference between heaven and hell is 45 inches of material, boy, you will be surprised. And you also contrast the notion of modest dress with taqwa, quoting the verse, the best garment is the garment of taqwa. Finally, you note that it is impossible to tell from the outside whether a woman's hijab is coerced or is donned from choice. So building on your equality paradigm, we'd like to explore the implications of shared responsibility for modesty. If you agree that modesty is a virtue in the Qur'an, what does this mean, and how may men and women embrace an ethic of modesty to be implemented in the public sphere?
Wow, there's a lot there, isn't there? Okay, so I still prioritize modesty, and I still feel that modesty has some correlation to items of clothing. And that does not mean that I consider a naked child to be immodest, for example. So the question then is, how does it evolve, and how do we consider it in what we call the public sphere? Unfortunately, we cannot have a conversation about Muslim women's dress without the politics of Muslim women's dress being on the table today. And until those politics have been resolved, then I will always err towards the side of a person who covers by choice, and I will be adamant in terms of choosing to wear in public settings. And public settings for me are formal. For me, for example, when I walk in my neighborhood every day, I'm not covering my hair, and I'm wearing a t-shirt, and I'm also wearing more like spandex pants. It's not something I would go to the market with, even though the market is less than a mile away, you know. And so I have determined in terms of my own bodily integrity that there are limits to how much I will uncover in front of certain people at certain times. But I realize that that's me personally. What I want to discuss instead is what is the kind of cultural milieu of respect in bodily integrity when we have all kinds of complications in society. Muslim women whose choice of how to demonstrate their modesty through the Islamic fashions, you know, of head covering and the like, to me are making expressions about their own agency. And I'm not in favor of anyone who makes any restrictions or determinations of how much of that agency they should express. So I am opposed to any of the bans that are put into place in any country, no matter where they're located on the planet and what the majority population is. I believe women should have full choice. Just as I believe a woman should have full choice not to have to cover, and yet in the milieu of certain Muslim majority contexts, it is impossible to imagine a woman exercising that choice and still being able to literally walk down the street. And so both circumstances have yielded a kind of cultural milieu, and operating within that milieu is not the same thing as choice. Sometimes it is a question of convenience. And unfortunately, we do not have the capacity to be able to remove the politics from the conversation. As far as what I think the Qur'an intended, I believe the Qur'an intended for us to maintain a respectful decorum between women and men, or between persons who might be attracted to each other, even if they are not in the same age group, which is a funny kind of thing, but I have to say that. Because there are places where a child, you know, can be seen as being attractive. There's this new movie out called Cutie, and people are arguing about whether or not it participates in or challenges certain rubrics of understanding for, you know, preteen girls in their, you know, development of their own identities. But the extent to which there is not the level of consciousness raised in societies enough for girls to be protected in the company of certain men. And so therefore I would err on the side of putting a barrier between them and the men by way of dress. So it is hard to express the spectrum of the choice, and at the same time the immersion into worlds that do not respect bodily integrity. But because my ancestors were brought to the Americas, you know, in chains on slave ships, and my foremothers were put on the auction block, and my Muslim heritage goes all the way back to my birth family on my mother's side. They came to America already as Muslims. The idea that you do not have the right to choose which parts of you to cover in certain places became my personal motivation, that I do not unveil certain parts of me in certain situations in accordance to my fullest right to choose and to observe the integrity that's necessary. That became a part of my consideration of the Islamic rubrics, and the politics of those discussions, as I said, which, you know, doesn't allow you to just have a personal opinion. But I did come away with the understanding that the Qur'an does encode modesty for both women and men, and that the ways in which modesty is expressed in context vary, and the ways in which we negotiate with those variants are also diverse. By the time you put all of these in here, then the trajectory of modesty, which is an expression of taqwa, or, you know, God consciousness, is almost lost. And that's really a shame, because I would like for people to have the option. But in reality, I know so many Muslim women in so many circumstances who are not able to even understand for themselves what would be their expression if it were not for so many forces on the outside. And because, again, context over text, I will prioritize the complication of Muslim women being able to assert their full choices over anything that's in the text, especially considering that the text is so ambiguous. I think the specific words that were used in the Qur'an were expressions of modesty in the 7th century context, like jalabibihinna. You know, the jilbab is not a universal form of dress, and yet it is an explicit phrase in the Qur'an. I used to believe that means you always have to wear a jilbab, an outer coat, and I did that for a few years, as I also chose to wear my face for a few years. But as I grew in terms of my relationship with society, that is, I became a single parent and went to work in an elementary school, I exercised different choices in terms of how I encoded modesty on my body. And I was thankful to be in a place where I could do that. And so therefore, again, like other things with regard to me and interpretation, my understanding of what the Qur'an intends with regard to dress has evolved, and it has not left off the politics of the veil, unfortunately.
Amina, can I just pick up on that and just ask you, are you saying, I don't know if I've understood you correctly, but are you saying two things? One of which is that, you know, in our particular specific historical juncture, it just so happens that, you know, the veil is politicized, you know, there is the politics of the veil. And yet at the same time, you're also saying that in certain social settings, the veil is important because neither the women nor the men involved in the kind of sexualities of that landscape are mature enough to understand you know, these bounds of modesty or encoding modesty on themselves. So are you saying that that it's just, are these two things true for you? That, you know, it's sometimes it's not really about the veil, but it happens to be about the veil? I mean, just maybe might elaborate there.
Well, I definitely think that the discourses over the veil are not always about the veil. It's about something else. However, I want to probably clarify a little bit between what I consider to be choice, when choice might include forms of nakedness, and any comments I made about the veil, because I don't see veil or nakedness as just the two options. And I just want to, and I don't think I was clear about that. What I meant in terms of, you know, bodily integrity, and I observed certain places where that is not being observed by other people, has to do with nakedness. In other words, is it possible? I mean, I was warned, you know, not to put naked pictures of my grandchildren on my Facebook page by a Jewish activist woman who said, you know, you just don't know who's perusing, you know, Facebook because of pedophilia. You know, she was right. And I thought to myself, she is right. And that's a shame that she is right. It is in terms of nakedness that I'm speaking. And because my ancestors, they weren't just forced out of the veils of the women who were veiled coming from Africa, because that was also part of their culture. Islam having preceded the slave route by 1,000 years in Africa, they were stripped naked. And from it, I have a DNA, I have a genetic codification that says nobody gets to see parts of my body except as I will. But I'm never going to exercise nakedness. Trust me, one of my daughters took me to a naked hot springs. I wore a bathing suit the whole time, and I thought to myself, this is not me. I can't do this. There's just too many things to see that I keep lowering my gaze, and I can't even walk because I'm so busy lowering my gaze. This is not me. This is just not me, you know? Some of the comments that I made had to do with choices that go to the level of choosing levels of nakedness, and they don't have to do with choosing veil. So choosing veiling and different levels of veiling in the context of modern society is so politicized that even in places where the cultural milieu is veiling, a woman really does not have full choice. So a woman in a quote unquote Western society who does choose to veil, including choosing to cover her face to wear niqab, is not in defiance of the cultural milieu. She is in the midst of the politics of deveiling. And the politics of deveiling is about as strong as the politics of veiling in the places where, like in the Gulf region, everybody wears it, even though, you know, nobody wears it whenever they go anywhere else, kind of thing, you know. And that's real. And because that's real, it says to me, I can't have a discussion about hijab in isolation, as if I can solve this problem just by looking at the few passages that are in the Qur'an with regard to it. We cannot. There is a heavy political component to it, and resolving that political component to me has to come first. And unfortunately, it comes first with a price paid by women themselves in those spaces.
Thank you so much for that clarification. I really understood a lot more about what you meant by in your comments on veiling and nakedness. That I really appreciated that. And with regard to the contextualization, it's interesting because that really ties back to your other points about needing to understand all of the different contexts that in which the text of the Quran is and has been read, right? In order to really be able to interpret it. So we're to our final question, and our final question is about the nature of the text itself. In the book Inside the Gender Jihad, you mentioned the silence of the text. You said, quote, you said, the text is silent. It needs interpretation and has always historically and currently been subjected to interpretation. We make it speak for us by asking of it. If we are narrow, we will get a narrow response or answer. If we are open, it will open us to even greater possibilities. We're curious as to what it means to say that the text is silent and that it gains meaning from interpretation. Are there certain people who make the text speak? What kind of commitment might it take to make it speak? Does this even relate to what you've said before about the text being a window to look through? Thank you.
Yes, this quotation actually started with Imam Ali, radiallahu anhu, who says the text is silent and we make it speak. I think it's interesting because, of course, he was in the oral culture. And so the idea of a silent text has different potential meanings than what I understand. And my understanding of it is related to the existence of a physical Qur'an in the home of many, if not all, Muslims. And yet it is not a companion text to their daily lives, but rather the interpretation of what the Imam says or the Mullah says, or the Maulana says, or the Guru says in context is what they think is holy or sacred. And I think that's quite interesting. So the text can remain wrapped in a lovely cloth on a top shelf, but it's still silent. Now, having said that, I want to be honest. The fact that I fell in love with the Qur'an means that I have a privilege. It means that from the beginning, it spoke to me. So I don't mean to say that it has to speak to everybody in that way. But instead, what I'm trying to say is that the Qur'an gives us such a wide repertoire of actual statements, but many of us have not come to align ourselves with the Qur'an in any way. When I ask people in certain settings now, tell me about your favorite verse in the Qur'an, why is it your favorite? To get people to understand, there's something from the Qur'an that speaks to you. And when it does, then own it. And when you own it, that becomes the key to unlocking the door, which is the Qur'an. Because the Qur'an is a portal into the ultimate reality. And if you don't have the key to unlock it, then you can pass back and forth through the door, but you kind of won't notice anything, And so you want to find a way to be able to have a personal relationship. So I really do try to encourage people, even just in translation, to try to find a way to be able to become intimate with the Qur'an and have the Qur'an be intimate to them. Without that, then the Qur'an does not speak to you. And so it is silent. And just like in the cartoon with Lionel, the adults are talking, wah, 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 wah. Like there's lots of words, but they're not words. They're not transformative. And so there is a kind of silence. But I have become interested in what I call the ambiguities of the Qur'an, which is where this statement actually came from when I was writing it. And that is that if you look at it, the Qur'an sometimes fills in certain gaps along the lines of a certain trajectory, and then it sometimes leaves a gap, which I think is very interesting. I want to give specific examples of it. Short surah at the end I keep blocking it with "La yuhituna bi shay'in min ilmihi illa bima sha." You will not encompass all of his knowledge except as Allah wills. But there's a short surah at the end. I'm just having one of those senior moments. There's a short surah at the end that actually goes through, in my mind, transitions of knowledge. That, it goes from ilm al-yaqeen to haqq al-yaqeen and, et cetera, et cetera. And I find it fascinating because it's one of the shortest surahs. I did an explanation out on my Patreon page recently, so I should be better to recall it. But it's interesting that if you take an evolution of the potential with regard to language itself, linguistics, rhetoric, hermeneutics, etc. If you take that and you watch the places where the Quran fills in the gaps, and then the places where there's a gap maintained, and then it goes on, you can surmise the filling of the gap in the middle because the trajectory is clear. Like you say, you give to little kids when you're teaching them about, you know, order. You say black, white, black, white, black, white, black. What comes next, right? So they're supposed to fill in white. It shows they're doing sequencing, right? In the sequence of the Qur'an, look at the places where those sequences have blank spots. And I think those are fascinating. And that was the silence that I was talking about at that time. But also because the Qur'an shifts between verbs and active participles or nouns. So there is like a do version and there's like a be version. And I think as I'm working now on this thing about ambiguity and embracing ambiguity in the Qur'an, I think that we need to study the extent to which the Qur'an gives a verbal base and a you know, sort of a verbal noun base for certain things, or which things are only done in noun form and which things are only done in verb form. I'd be really curious. It's a real big project, and it's not a project that I have taken on, but I've been really interested in it. And just tacitly, when you're reading the Qur'an, it's not sufficient to gather the data. But I am curious about the ways in which the Qur'an manipulates the language itself to make its message, because I have seen that the ways in which the Qur'an says a thing lends itself to deeper and deeper levels of understanding for the purpose of guidance. That somehow it takes the human being from its current state into its next highest state, so that, you know, we arrive at our own perfected soul, you know? And so I am very much interested in what goes unsaid in the Qur'an, or what's said only in verbal form, and what's said only in noun form, and what we might surmise from the ways in which these things build in that, you know, sequence with something missing or not, what ways in which we fill in that gap based on our understanding of, you know, how a sequence should go. So this is a really interesting kind of linguistic project, which unfortunately I don't think I'm going to have the opportunity to be able to pursue. But I'm very interested in the fact that, first of all, the literal thing that people say about Quran usually is about application. They don't say literal in terms of all this other beautiful stuff that's in the Quran. So this is not about the qat'i. This is not about that kind of thing. It's about the breath, you know, the nafs ar-Rahman. It's about the breath that is breathed into this language in this text, and how we engage with that language, and how our capacity to engage with it sweeps us up into realms of possibilities. And that to me is in fact exquisitely divine.
It's a really lovely reflection on you know, just the very the kind of oral context, I guess, in which the Quran must have emerged in the 7th century through the mouth of the Prophet, to all those who, you know, who knew their words very well, who can mince their words, who could produce beautiful rhetoric and poetry. But this Quran comes with a kind of message, and I think your word transformative is very interesting here, because it wasn't just empty words, words constructed in a particular way, with a view to you know, effecting a particular impact. And I'm
not
interested.
Not just descriptive, yes, but prescriptive. Yes.
Yeah. And you use it's interesting that I think a lot of the language that you yourself used to talk about your hermeneutics contains these kind of almost 3 steps of prefiguring, configuring, and refiguring, which is, you know, a hermeneutical approach, which has been touched on by certain, I think, thinkers in the European tradition, but not to do with the Quran. I mean, they've applied it to kind of other religious texts, but it's interesting that we're yet to do this for the Quran, and it's something that I'm quite interested in you know, how do we look at language and how it impacts the narration itself, which I don't know. I mean, it's something very bizarre, because we both, Karen and I, both work on the Quran all the time, so it's constantly with us. And we certainly do value that thought that I think you expressed earlier, which is you get out of it as much as you give to it. And the idea of the piecemeal approach never really works. I mean, one has a sense that the Quran itself is a kind of like you said, it's a portal, but also when you actually begin to recite or read it, you feel like you're joining a continuing narration. It's not like it's ever stops. It's there, but you're just not conscious of it. It's like a carousel. It's always going around. You step on and step off. And I'm interested in the hermeneutics of that. I mean, maybe you could just perhaps here just add a little bit. Any thoughts perhaps provoked by my own commentary here on your comments? I just want to explore that with you a little more. So it's really the world of hermeneutics and how that's enhanced by our actual, you know, recitation of the Quran, engaging, reading the Arabic, knowing Arabic. I mean, that's also a privileged position, surely, Amina. It's not a position that can be, you know, extracted by reading an English translation of the Quran. However, I must say that if you know the Quran in Arabic and you can read it in English, you can always make a better translation of the English. There's always a way of enhancing the English, the Quranic English. But to go back to the point, I think, you know, what we do with this issue of language, because the Quran is fascinated at a linguistic composite level, as you were saying. So just
I think that I have borrowed from some Sufi commentators who express the idea that there are, you know, a multiplicity of interpretations for, you know, every word. Because in my lifetime, as I said, I was really privileged. I fell in love with the Quran in just an English translation that I can no longer tolerate, which is really very funny. You know, I turned that love into a lifetime. You know, I mean, I literally went to graduate school for study of the Quran, you know. And yet, as I said, I'm still doing, you know, little short blurbs, Qur'anic commentary for my Patreon page. And usually the ones that I write for the Patreon page are just on the shorter surahs that, you know, you tend to repeat again and again for your performance of Salat. Sometimes I'm standing there thinking, praying Salat, and I just thought, oh, you know, this is just so much fun. I think I'll just write about it, you know, for the Patreon page. And so I do, you know, I just give like a little bit of tafsir, just to remind us to, you know, to reflect on it. And so in that respect, Professor Hamza, I think some people are lucky in that when they immerse themselves into the study, they don't lose the beauty. Other people are only, you know, concerned with the politics of, you know, how to control other people through the Quran. But when you allow for it, I think the Quran responds to you at every state and every station when you return to it. And that's why the more you put into it, the more you get out of it. And unfortunately, when you're just learning and, you know, kids are forced to memorize and you slap them on the hand with the ruler and everything, you kind of don't understand what we're talking about. But fortunately, as mature adults, our relationship is one really of a tremendous amount of, you know, love and inspiration from the Quran itself. And that's why it is that when people say, well, how can you believe in the Quran and it's not equal and da, da, da. I said, yeah, you know, there are 6 or 7 problematic verses. I said, but I would by no means throw the baby away with the bath. There's so much beauty and there's so much challenge. I require myself to read Quran, you know, every day during the month of Ramadan. It used to be I would finish the Quran every Ramadan, but I'm getting older and it takes longer. And unfortunately, no matter what I do, I'm always interested in the interpretive part. So I can't just read. I'm thinking, wait a second now, how, you know? So I'm managing about a half, and this time I think I might have even gotten third, even during lockdown. So it's getting less and less that I can read the whole Quran, you know, just for Ramadan. And yet, every time I read it, I find something new. And I find that fascinating because even when I am reciting the ones that I've already memorized, new things still come to me. And that is, I think, what the Sufis meant with regard to this spectrum of possible meaning. And that is that the Quran is a portal into the ultimate reality. And if you are privileged to find the keys to unlock and walk through that portal, what a lovely view.
Thank you so much for that. And I really love the way that you contrasted the ways of reading the Quran in terms of some people reading it in terms of the politics of control, and other people reading it in terms of the receiving a message. And it gets back into so many of the things that we've covered here in this interview of how to reinterpret gender verses, of how to understand the gender inside of ourselves or inside of people, and the active and the passive. And your description of the way, your way of understanding the Quran really, I think, is really resonant for these larger, these other social questions. It's very personal to you, but it's also resonant for these social questions of how to look at women and gender. And so we just want to thank you again. And this was a very beautiful interview. And we feel really privileged to have spoken to you about your views on the Quran and gender and hermeneutics and all of it. And so thank you very much.
Yes, the pleasure is really all mine, because there are a few places where I get to indulge in just to talk about the Quran. And since the two of you have such a keen perspective on the topic, it just meant that I felt that I could just sort of overflow with that. And I really appreciate that.
Thank you.
We really appreciate it too. Thank you.
Good night. Assalamu alaikum.